When it comes to safety critical items on a car, tyres and brakes are top of the list. Sometimes they may not look all that exciting, just a simple metal disc or some friction material on a pad, but these are actually extremely important to the aftermarket. Cars will always need brakes, brake checks, brake servicing, and to stay safe. But has the braking industry changed over the last few years? Have there been developments? Or is it a case of no friction at all, everything is as it was?
Fundamentally, I don't think braking's changed really much over the last decade. We've still got the good old discs and pads that everyone talks about, everyone changes. The principles have made remain pretty much the same over the years, and I don't really see it changing much, to be honest. Having said that, obviously there's a lot of progression towards improving the efficiency of braking, sustainability, and obviously a lot of hybrid and electric vehicles now. So we've got the regenerative braking system within them, but we're still using generally discs and pads to perform that function. It doesn't matter how much regenerative braking that you've got on a vehicle, there's never going to be enough to perform an emergency stop. And depending on the state of charge of the battery, that can have an effect on how much regenerative braking that you can have as well. So if the battery is fully charged, there's much less regenerative braking that's going to take place. So you need the conventional brake system to take control of that in that instance. So yeah, it's not going to change much. Technology is just going to develop, and we're just going to move on and progress with it.
Customer expectations are also changing, especially when it comes to noise, vibration and harshness. A car should leave the workshop with no noise coming from the brakes, like mine. But new technologies don't exactly help. Electric vehicles have quieter motors, so therefore quieter braking is expected. SUVs have longer suspension arms and therefore have more issues around noise and vibration in that area. So what is actually leading to increased noise, vibration and harshness? What should garages be aware of?
Harmut Kiesling, technical sales manager and trainer at TMD Friction, explained why it's not always easy to determine the cause of brake pad noise. He said, people often assume that the brake pad is to blame, wrongly. It's often actually worn suspension parts or parts that deviate greatly from the original equipment. These vibrate audibly when the driver applies the brakes. In these cases, expert knowledge is required to determine the root cause.
Now, when it comes to reducing brake squeal and lubricating braking products, for decades, workshops have been using this stuff, copper grease. But in the modern age, should this still be used? Or is a move to more specific lubricants for braking components needed and essential to maintain safety?
The number one rule is do not use copper grease. I've been telling mechanics for my whole career is I should be using copper grease, but they've been using it for 30 years, and why should they change? But technology does move on, so it's important that they don't use copper grease, but we do need to lubricate the pad at the abutment points to aid free movement. So we would recommend a copper-free, metal-free, high melting point petroleum-based grease for the brake pad environment, and a silicon-based grease when you're lubricating the slider pins. It's important to clean the slider pins as well, and obviously re-lubricate them.
One of the biggest changes to the braking market hasn't come from within the industry itself, but rather from external factors, especially with electric vehicles. But how does braking on these new vehicles operate? What are the key differences that technicians need to be aware of?
So the biggest one that immediately is going to come to mind for most people, and it's completely correct, is basically regenerative braking or regen braking. Really, the friction brake, the brake pad and the disc are used a lot less in an EV than they would be used in an internal combustion engine. For your general motorway driving, for your around town driving, where you're not really needing to press on the brakes, you're really not going to be using the friction brake in those situations. Aside from regen braking, which is obviously the major one, the big difference in terms of brake systems, but also the whole vehicle, is that EVs are much, much heavier than their combustion engine counterparts. So for a very similar model, because of the weight and size of the electric vehicle battery, it's going to be much, much bigger. So with that, obviously, the force and energy requirement to dissipate by the brake increases quite substantially. So really, you need a brake you can absolutely trust in a situation where you're going to need those high deceleration moments and scenarios, but also with a very, very high energy, heavy vehicle that you're looking to stop.
So, with this in mind, how important is it that garages purchase the right brake pads, potentially dedicated brake pads, for electric vehicles themselves?
EVs do demand a specific product. They do demand a dedicated product. They have their own needs that need to be addressed. So you should always buy from a brand who's done the research and knows the needs of EVs like we have.
Now, when it comes to sustainability, there is another fact to consider, and it's this: the brake pad and the Euro 7 regulations. Coming into effect next year, they maintain the status quo when it comes to regular vehicle emissions, but they do include guidelines for the emissions of particulate matter, specifically PM2.5, that comes from tyres and brakes. Friction material causes dust, which is particulate matter, and it can be hazardous to health, getting into the air and the water supply as well. Now, currently the onus is on vehicle manufacturers to ensure they reduce emissions of PM2.5 from tyres and brakes. But as time goes on, aftermarket companies are likely to need to follow the guidelines themselves, especially if they want to remain relevant to what is coming in the future. And that means that they need to make sure they are up to date with the latest rules. And for workshops, they need to be fitting quality parts from reputable suppliers.
Euro 7 with the kind of particulate emission is our next challenge, and we are looking and staying on the cutting edge of all of that. It's going to be a challenge, I think, for a lot of the aftermarket. The start of things is clear guidance would be a very good positive start for us manufacturers in terms of how it will impact the aftermarket. We're aware of competitors taking the first steps, and we're keeping a close eye on things and putting our materials forward for particulate testing in the near future.
But despite the fact that discs and pads are not fundamentally changing, what other areas should technicians be aware of when it comes to servicing brakes, especially on newer vehicles?
So the technology, they just need to keep on top of it. They need to obviously be aware of changes. There's not huge changes happening at the moment, but some of these new master cylinders. So on a modern Astra, you've physically got to use diagnostic equipment to change the brake pads, because if you don't put it into service mode, when you push the piston back, you can damage the ABS pump or master cylinder on that vehicle. So it's important that you keep up to speed with those types of vehicles.
So it's not quite full stop yet in the braking market. Small changes are coming through, especially when it comes to maintenance methods, new ways of thinking about electric vehicle brakes, or changing lubrication methods to ensure that we're moving away from copper grease. But ultimately, as a safety critical item, the onus is on the technician and the garage to make sure that brakes are maintained properly. Proper maintenance methods are followed, and safety checks are conducted. So when a car drives out of the workshop, it does so in a safe manner. With over 35 million passenger cars on the road today of varying different powertrain types, the braking market isn't going to change anytime soon. But with more sustainability coming in, garages need to think about where they're getting their brakes from and making sure that the system is maintained properly.